He made efforts to be there, and particularly, I think, on a regular basis at bedtime. That degree of continuity, when you're not going to be around all the time, that there are some periods when you need to have continuity, and that was one of them, and that was one which could make a real impact. I mean, bedtime stories are things that, children probably don't get so much nowadays, but it was very important in my day.
For over 70 years, they stood side by side, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, the royal couple admired around the world. But behind the palace walls, there was a decision that shocked even their closest allies. Prince Philip no longer wanted to live with the Queen. Insiders say this wasn't a result of marital trouble. In fact, the Queen understood and respected Philip's decision. After decades of rigid royal routines and endless public appearances, Philippe simply wanted peace, quiet, and freedom in his final chapter. At Wood Farm, he could live like a regular person. No formalities, no staff in uniform, and no tight schedules. But still, it raised eyebrows. Royal watchers whispered, was this really just about peace and quiet, or was there more beneath the surface? Well, it turns out Princess Anne finally broke the silence, and what she said left royal watchers speechless.
I think corporate relationships are quite different. I mean, the end product is different.
Prince Philip and Princess Anne shared a bond that stood out in a family full of formalities. While other royals often leaned toward polished public image and diplomacy, Anne and Philip had something else in common: bluntness, dry humor, and a strong sense of duty. But behind those traits was a deep, quiet connection. Anne wasn't just his daughter, she was his confidant. From a young age, Anne mirrored her father's straightforward nature. Neither of them liked fuss, they both valued efficiency and results over appearances. And as Philip aged, especially during his retreat to Wood Farm, it became clear that Anne was the one who understood him the most. While others in the family may have tiptoed around uncomfortable topics, Anne and Philip had real conversations. Family insiders often said that Anne was the only royal who could truly keep up with Philip, both intellectually and emotionally. They could be sitting in silence or trading sarcastic remarks, but there was always a mutual understanding. And that's likely why, in his final years, Philip began opening up to her in ways he hadn't before. He shared with her not just his personal regrets, but his quiet frustrations, how the crown had changed his life, how his marriage evolved over time, and what he truly wanted in those last few years of peace. Anne, always loyal, kept it all to herself. She respected his need for privacy, but after his passing, she finally spoke out and revealed the side of her father few had ever seen. But to understand what Prince Philip told Anne, we need to go all the way back to where it all began. Elizabeth and Philip first met when she was just 13 years old. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a casual meeting during a royal visit. But for Elizabeth, it was unforgettable. Philip was confident, charming, and a naval cadet with a mischievous streak. Even then, he stood out. While others may have dismissed it as a teenage crush, Elizabeth knew what she wanted. She started writing letters to Philip, and he wrote back. Over the next few years, even during World War II, they stayed in touch. While Philip served bravely in the Royal Navy, their connection only grew stronger through those private letters. By the time the war ended, Elizabeth's feelings hadn't changed. She was in love, and Philip by then felt the same, but their relationship wasn't exactly welcomed by everyone in the royal family. Philip, though born a prince, came from a financially struggling background. His sisters were married to Germans, and he didn't have the pedigree some courtiers thought was necessary. Still, Elizabeth pushed back, and eventually they were allowed to marry. But for Philip, marrying into the British royal family came with a price. He had to give up everything: his Greek and Danish royal titles, his foreign loyalties, even his religion. He became a British subject, changed his name to Mountbatten, and walked away from his identity for love. Their wedding in 1947 was a national celebration. It looked like a fairy tale, but from the very start, their love story was under pressure. Everything changed in 1952. King George VI died suddenly, and Elizabeth was now queen. Overnight, their roles flipped. Elizabeth was no longer just Philip's wife. she was the monarch. For Philip, that meant the promising naval career he had worked so hard to build came to a sudden halt. He had just been promoted, and there were expectations he would climb even higher in the Navy. But as Queen Elizabeth stepped into her new role, Philip had to abandon his ambitions. And then came the small humiliations. The fact that he couldn't pass on his surname to his children, that he had to walk 2 steps behind his wife at public events, that he had no official role other than consort. Behind closed doors, it wasn't easy. Philip was proud, independent, and used to leading. Now he was forced into the background. He supported the Queen fully, but it was clear that he struggled with his new reality.
There's an awful lot of things that if I was to read them now, I'd say, well, good God, I wish to God I hadn't said that.
Prince Philip may have been the Queen's husband, but he was never fully at peace with the role he was given. From the moment Elizabeth became Queen, his personal identity began to slip through the cracks. One of his biggest frustrations? Not being able to pass on his family name to his children. He once called himself a bloody amoeba because he felt invisible in his own home. That one quote summed up a deep, ongoing struggle. He was present, but his influence was constantly sidelined. When their first children, Charles and Anne, were born, the royal household insisted they carry the Queen's family name, Windsor. Philip pushed back. He wanted them to take his surname, Mountbatten. This wasn't just about a name. For Philip, it was about legacy, about being more than just a ceremonial figure. The debate caused real tension behind palace doors. Eventually, a compromise was made. Their descendants without royal titles would use Mountbatten Windsor, but by then, the damage had been done. Philip had been made to feel like a guest in his own family. And it didn't stop there. Philip had ideas about how to modernize the monarchy. He wanted to bring in cameras, create documentaries, and make the royal family more accessible to the public. Some of his ideas were ahead of their time, but more often than not, they were met with resistance. Royal tradition outweighed innovation, and Philip's voice was often just politely ignored. He may have worn the uniform and waved from the balcony, but inside the palace, he was fighting a battle that no one really saw. One where duty clashed with identity, and where silence became his only real weapon.
There are a lot of problems and difficulties. Inevitably, it's an awkward situation to be in. There's only one other person really like me, and that's Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and so we occasionally discuss that.
As time went on, Philip found his own rhythm, just not always beside the Queen. He stayed loyal, always showing up when it mattered, but he started carving out space for himself. He developed deep interests in ecology, wrote books on nature and philosophy, and stayed active with the Duke of Edinburgh's award. These were passions he could call his own, but even those were done from the sidelines. Philip was never the main act, and over the years, that quiet separation turned into a lifestyle. By the time he hit his 90s, he officially stepped back from royal duties, and instead of staying at Buckingham Palace, he chose to live at Wood Farm, a modest home on the Sandringham estate. There was no drama, no big fallout. He and the Queen simply decided that living apart worked better for them. He found peace in the countryside, away from cameras, ceremonies, and schedules, and the Queen respected that. But for outsiders, it raised eyebrows. What kind of royal couple lives apart by choice? But why? Was it distance out of love or out of resentment? This is where Princess Anne finally reveals everything. Princess Anne didn't sugarcoat it, she never does. When asked why her father spent his final years away from Buckingham Palace, she answered simply, he wanted peace. Anne said her father had spent his entire life walking behind someone else, always playing the role of consort, never king. He'd done his duty, she explained, and he wanted a life outside the rigidity of court. Anne described her father as a man who had given everything to the monarchy, his identity, his ambitions, even his name. By the time he reached his 90s, he felt no guilt stepping back. He had earned it. He didn't need to be seen, she added. He just needed to be left alone. And it wasn't just Anne who supported this. Both Charles and Andrew reportedly agreed with her. Charles, in particular, had a new understanding of his father's quiet frustrations as he took on more royal responsibility himself. They knew Philip wasn't running away from the Queen. He was just stepping into something he'd never really had, freedom on his own terms. He loved the Queen. There was no doubt about that, but after a lifetime of public duty, he chose simplicity, solitude, and a slower pace. Anne's words didn't expose a scandal. They exposed something more powerful, a man who wanted to end his life not in the spotlight, but in peace.
I spoke to the Princess Royal last week, And Princess Royal tells me you are the best reader of bedtime stories.
What?
She said she has great fond memories of you reading bedtime stories to them.
I don't remember.
You don't remember it at all?
Well, yes, I suppose I do, but
How important was fatherhood compared with being the Queen's consort? Was it something you were conscious of, a role you were conscious of fulfilling?
no.
Well,
I mean, I was a father. Are you a father?
I am.
What do you think about it in philosophical
I
terms?
worried a lot about the prospect of it when the children were coming
Well,
along.
yes, and so did I, but and you worry about the children themselves. But
Prince Philip's final chapter wasn't written inside the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, but in the quiet corners of Wood Farm. No staff buzzing around, no press waiting outside, just peace, open fields, and a man who had given everything to duty finally choosing himself. It was bittersweet. For over 7 decades, he stood beside the Queen, unwavering. But in the end, he stepped away, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but simply because he was tired. And Queen Elizabeth understood that. Publicly, she never objected. She even acknowledged his need for rest and space. That quiet acceptance said more about their relationship than any royal statement ever could. Their love had changed. It wasn't the kind that needed to be seen at state dinners or parades. It had matured into something softer, more private, built on years of shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and knowing when to let each other go a little so both could breathe. Philip didn't abandon the Queen. He simply redefined what love looked like in the final stretch of life. A kind of love where freedom wasn't a betrayal, it was a gift. Now that you've seen how Prince Philip chose to live out his final years, do you guys think he was justified in wanting that distance? Or do you think it was a quiet signal of deeper issues between him and the Queen? Let me know in the comments. And if you thought this story was surprising, wait until you hear what Prince Harry revealed about his grandfather's final wishes. That one's coming up next, so don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss it.